So, what happened after Final Fantasy VII? Well, as any fan of the series has discovered by now, it's obvious that a whole lot of stuff has taken place since the livestream fought back the meteor fall called forth by Sephiroth. The straight-to-DVD movie Advent Children that came out just a few months ago picked up about 2 years after the end of the video game, but that's not all there is to the story. Another year after that brings us to the events of Dirge of Cerberus, which is the latest in a surprisingly sudden and sizable line of spin-off products based on Final Fantasy VII. But where does Dirge of Cerberus fit in? Well, in quite a few places, actually, since the game puts players in control of a guy that's arguably the most popular optional character in history, who's Vincent Valentine. We get to learn a lot about his background, his true origins, and how deep his ties to Shinra really go. Players will also get to learn a couple of extra tidbits about Yuffie, Ketchi/Reeve, and some of the more behind-the-scenes goings-on that we didn't really know about before. There's also kind of a concurrent story that goes along with the historical references involving an elite military band of killers that's called Deep Ground, but if I get too much into that, I'd probably spoil things. Of course, the most surprising thing about Dirge is that despite its RPG roots, it's actually a shooter this time. But to be clear, it isn't the first-person shooter that the pre-release materials have claimed it to be. You can actually play in either the third or first-person perspectives, and at any time. And there are some occasional adventuring elements with Ketchi and a number of alternative melee special attacks to toy around with as well. The question we get most from our readers, though, is how exactly do you play? And the answer is actually quite simple. It's just the controls are very traditional, and it works like your standard shooter. R1 fires the trigger, R2 reloads your guns, X jumps over and activates action spots, etc. It's your typical shooter fare. Where the game really stands out as unique, though, is with its customization system. Since Dirge is from an RPG background, like I mentioned earlier, it retains some of that feel despite its shooting. These RPG elements mean that players can gain experience for killing enemies, or by meeting a number of predisposed mission requirements like protecting a specific number of soldiers or finding particular information files, things like that. And finishing level quickly with a high accuracy rate will also get you bonuses, and so on and so forth. But I think the most interesting bit of Dirge of Cerberus is its gun modification, since as you progress, you'll be able to obtain and upgrade a small assortment of gun barrels, attachments, and items and things like that to create the gun that's perfect for your playstyle. So even though you have your handgun, machine gun, and sniper rifle, which are the types of weapons you can create with the parts, the good news is that you can actually modify those. You can give them a good number of extra features that will power them up in different ways, give them special elemental properties, and you can swap between 3 preset customizations, so you don't have to spend an exorbitant amount of time in a menu system fiddling around with things. Now, I know it's no secret that the Japanese version came under a lot of heat for its shortcomings because it had a number of real problems with its targeting and its AI, and a couple of other bugs that really kept it from being a AAA game. The good news is that the American version has actually fixed a number of those problems because targeting enemies is a whole lot easier than it used to be, various balancing tweaks have been added in, and Vincent's limit break transformations, which allows you to turn yourself into the same monsters that you could in Final Fantasy VII, they're actually useful now. Now, I can't tell you that the AI has been improved on much because most enemies still work as human targets, but the game is harder by default. They've gotten rid of the easiest setting, and there are a number of extra modes and challenges that have been thrown in for US gamers that weren't in the original Japanese version. Of course, the real question is, are these fixes enough to make Dirge of Cerberus worthwhile? Well, that depends on who you are, because if you're a Final Fantasy VII fan, then most definitely. The fixes to the US version have made it much better, and I can't deny that there's some actual moments of real fun that you can do in there. Dirge also does a really good job of answering questions that we always wondered about, particularly about Lucretia and how Vincent came to be who he is. The game's actually also surprisingly lengthy for a shooter as well, and it can last in upwards of about 15 to 20 hours if you engage in the side missions and other goodies on top of the main mission. The problem that Dirge ultimately faces, though, is that for one, it tells its story a little too well. There are way too many interruptions and pauses in the action so that you can view a cutscene after cutscene after cutscene, and the pacing feels disjointed, and a small portion of them seem almost arbitrary, not really a real narrative. The bigger issue, though, is that Cerberus doesn't come close to the gameplay depth of other shooters on the PlayStation 2, games like Red Faction or Time Splitters or Black, because all of those are fundamentally better in how they're tuned and how they work, and in the level of technology that powers them. The non-aggressive AI isn't too hot either, and it keeps the challenge a little too low for veteran shooter fans. And the removal of the multiplayer mode that was in the Japanese version is pretty disappointing, especially since there are so many current-gen PlayStation 2 shooters right now that have that feature. Despite all this, Dirge of Cerberus is actually still a pretty decent game. It's easy to pick up, it has a wealth of cool fodder for Final Fantasy fans, and it serves as a nice diversion in a summer that's frankly been filled with sports titles and movie license games. So in the end, Midgar fans should definitely give it a look, but for anyone else, I would say that Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII deserves a guarded but casual recommendation.